And you could say that one of the things in economics, there are orthodox views and there are heterodox views, schools of thought. And modern monetary theory is certainly one of those more heterodox schools of thought. And what it does is that it looks at money, currencies, uh, deficits, debt, and looks at a lot of these things in ways that turn our what we thought we understood, our common sense understanding of a lot of things, it turns it on its head. So I guess I could say we could say things like we worry about the deficits and we worry about the national debt. You hear this all the time. Worry about the debt to China. I've heard that one before, and a lot of these things. And anytime people bring up a lot of issues, say federal programs or whatever, we ask, well, how are we going to pay for it? And the question is a lot of this worry justified? And what MMT economists will say is that no, a lot of these worries and concerns actually are not justified. So a basic dichotomy, a basic concept that could be talked about in MMT is the difference between a currency issuer and a currency user. There are currency issuers, certain governments or whatever, they issue their own currency, like the US government issues the dollar, US dollar, Canadian government issues the Canadian dollar, the Mexican government issues the peso, Japan issues the yen, and so forth and so on. They're not gonna run out of their currency. They're currency issuers. Then there are currency users. That would be like households, businesses. Here in the US, be like state and local governments are currency users. This would be one reason why the analogy between the federal government and a household, it doesn't work. The federal government issues the US dollar. Households do not, or they're not supposed to. And if they do get caught, you're going to be in trouble. So when the government, so as a matter of logical ordering, and we'll just use the US government as an example, the dollar has to be spent into existence first. If we go way back all the way back to day one when they first started issuing the US dollar, the dollar had to be spent into existence first before there were any dollars to take back in taxes. Okay? We often talk about, our federal taxes are paying for the federal spending. But the federal spending had to have come first before the taxes. So the question is, well, what's the function of federal taxes? The function of the taxes for the federal government or any other currency issuing government is first and foremost to create an aggregate demand for the intrinsically worthless currency. The government will spend the dollars into existence, and then put a tax on it and say that tax obligation can only be fulfilled in a currency that we issue. So there's a demand for it. Before, if there wasn't a tax, there really wouldn't be. It's just, go back a couple hundred years, it was just, little pieces of paper, But now the government says, we want that back in the form of a tax. Now there's a demand for it. So after that, taxes can function to discourage, say, can be used to manage the economy. For example, if inflation sets in because there's too many dollars out there or whatever, you could tax out the excess currency. Taxation can be used to maybe discourage certain behaviors that are deemed undesirable. For example, you could say tax pollution or something. We don't want pollution, and so if you tax pollution enough, people might pollute because they might say, well, it costs too much to maybe change the way we do business. So we'll just pollute a little bit, and it's better for profits or whatever. But you could tax the pollution. If you tax it high enough, you could discourage the behavior. Or people will talk about taxing Wall Street speculation, for example. The point would be really, it's nothing to do with raising revenue. It has to do with discouraging that behavior. So it's often said that among MMT economists that taxes drive the currency. That's its function, to drive the currency. So when the government spends, they're literally creating dollars every time they spend from an MMT perspective. And how is this done? By crediting accounts. When they spend, they credit accounts, and that is the creation of dollars. Taxation is just the opposite. It's the destruction of dollars by debiting accounts. It's all just keystrokes. To use an analogy, you could think of a scorekeeper at a football game. The team gets a touchdown, they get 6 points. Nobody asks, well, where are they going to get the points put on the board? They just type them in. A referee could come out and say, oh, the touchdown didn't count. Well, you got to take the 6 points off the board. You take the 6 points off. Where'd they go? They went back into thin air. So basically, from my understanding, the basic understanding, the operational way of how this all works is that Congress will authorize the spending. And then the Treasury instructs the Fed. The Fed is the central bank. It's basically the Treasury's bank. And so, say they send we had the whole $1,200 payments that we were getting from this COVID response. So say you're going to send Gregg the $1,200 or something. The Treasury says to the Fed, send Gregg $1,200. And then the Fed, what they'll do is they'll mark up Gregg's bank reserve account by $1,200, and then they in turn mark up the checking account by $1,200, Gregg's checking account. And so voila, $1,200 just got created. Keystrokes by marking up accounts. The opposite, taxation is the opposite. You have to pay your taxes, and they could they could deduct the taxes from the account, checking account, and then from the reserve account, and it's gone. It's numbers on a spreadsheet. It's numbers on a computer. You'll often hear people say, MMT is about printing money. It's just cranking up the printing presses or whatever. Well, operationally, my understanding is that printing money doesn't actually create any net dollars. It doesn't add any dollars to the economy. It's just transferring numbers from a balance sheet of the Fed, the central bank, numbers on little pieces of paper you can carry around in your pocket. There's nothing added here. It's the numbers that's the money, not the paper. And maybe perhaps that's some way of us thinking of money being something concrete, or we think of it as a commodity or something. But it's really the numbers. It's a unit of account. Okay. What MMT's economists will say is that from the point of view of the currency issuer, like the federal government, it's not that they're not dollar constrained. They're not money constrained. They issue the currency. They can issue all the currency they want. How? By Congress authorizing the spending, and then the Treasury and the central bank do their operations to mark up various accounts. The real constraint is the real resources in the economy. Okay? You have to spend it on something. So when people say, how are we going to pay for it? Well, you hear this a lot. At least I do. People might say, Medicare for all or Green New Deal or whatever. We've heard this a lot. Well, how are you going to pay for it? Well, the government, the Congress authorizes the spending. The question is, do we have the real resources to do whatever it is they're spending on? So, if you want to spend on the military, the government spends on the military, and you want to increase the military. It's not a question of whether or not they have the dollars to do it. The question is, do you have enough people for soldiers, or do you have enough, guns and bullets and tanks and planes or whatever? And if not, do you have the productive capacity as a nation to produce more of these things that you need. Or you could say, people might talk about, Medicare for all. How are we going to pay for it? MMT economists will tell you, well, it's Congress authorizes the spending, and then you mark up the relevant accounts. That's not an issue. The issue is, if you want to have healthcare for all, do we have the real resources for it? Do we have enough doctors? Do we have enough nurses? Do we have enough hospitals and hospital beds and medicine and all this sort of thing? And if not, do we have the real resources to produce what's needed to meet that real demand? So that's a distinction that's made with MMT, within MMT. It's not a question of how are we going to pay for it is a non-issue from a currency issuer. The question is, do we have the real resources to do whatever it is the policy agenda happens to be? Okay. So this could come in now. If you can understand this, what people will talk about, inflation risks. Okay. I hear people talking about, people criticize MMT and say, oh, we're going to become Zimbabwe or the Weimar Republic, and hyperinflation and all this. What the key is spending the dollars into existence, not to exceed the productive capacity of a nation, not to exceed the amount of real resources that are available and how much can be produced. In an analogy that I've seen used before, you could think of a sink, and then you have the faucet to put water in. You have the plug for the drain, right? The sink could be thought of as the economy, the whole productive capacity, and the water flowing from the sink faucet could be thought of as, say, the government spending, and the plug could be thought of as the taxes. So you could fill that water up in that sink, and you plug it up and fill it up, and you could fill it to the top. But if you keep running that water, it'll overflow. So, and the overflowing could be an analogy to inflation setting in. So you could have the government spend, which would be like the water flowing into the sink, and you want to get it to the point where it's full but not overflowing. You see, you want to, and you can, and if it starts to overflow, you can tax out that excess currency, which is analogous to pulling the plug and draining out some of that water. See, or you could slow down the faucet, unplug it, drain out the water just enough, and find that sweet spot where it stays full. So, and you just to keep it from overflowing. You don't want that inflation. You don't want the spending on the part of the federal government or any government issues of currency to exceed the productive capacity of a nation, to exceed the real resources that are available, whether it's labor or capital goods, machines, all this sort of thing. And so that's the function of or should be the function of the spending and the taxation, is we should worry about bringing the economy to its full productive capacity. And the last thing I knew, which was before this whole COVID thing, I kept hearing we were probably at 75, 80% of our productive capacity of a nation. So there was plenty of more room for spending. Plenty of people that were, say, unemployed, plenty of idle capital. We definitely had what you call fiscal space, what they call fiscal space. There's more room to spend to get that economy up where it should be. At this point, I'll bring up, and I brought this up in one of my emails. I talked about sectoral balances. Sectoral balances is a macro accounting identity. Okay, and to put it in the simple linguistic terms, you could talk about the federal deficit on one side of this equation equals the domestic sector surplus and the foreign sector surplus combined. We could combine the domestic and foreign sectors and call them the non-federal sector or whatever. This is just based on the notion, perhaps you've all heard, that one person's spending is another person's income. You go to the store, spend $50, and just for the sake of simplicity, assuming there's no sales tax, that becomes $50 income for the store. You know, for everything you spend, it becomes the income somewhere else. The same notion, from the perspective of sectoral balances, is that for every penny that the federal government spends, it's got to go somewhere. It's either going somewhere here in the domestic sector, or it's going to go someplace outside the country in the foreign sector. So if the government spending is greater than the federal taxes, you have by definition a deficit. They're spending more than they're taking back in through taxes. On the flip side of that, though, that means that the combined domestic and foreign sector are getting more US dollars in than are leaving. You know, the federal government's deficit is a non-federal surplus, right down to the penny, and it can't be any other way. That's how we have aggregate net savings of dollars. You know, that's how households save. You know, another reason why we wouldn't want to compare the household to the government. They have a deficit, we have a surplus. If they have a surplus, the federal government has a surplus, that means that the taxation is greater than the spending. That means that they're taking more dollars out of the economy than they're putting back in, which means from our point of view out here, the domestic and foreign sectors, more dollars are leaving the economy than coming back in. And now we're in deficit. So you see what I'm saying? It's just simple accounting. It's like two sides of a balance sheet. Federal government's deficit, our surplus. Their surplus is our deficit. And this is kind of what makes it bad when people focus on, oh, we got to lower the deficits. We got to lower the deficits. Well, then we're going to be increasing our deficits. You know, we're going to be draining savings of dollars out of the economy, and that an economy can't sustain itself very long. The focus should be not balancing a federal budget. The balance should be the focus should be on balancing the economy. It's just like I was saying a minute ago. The policy should be bringing the economy to its full productive capacity. You know, and then the deficit is whatever it is. It's a residual. You know, they spend what they need to spend in order to keep us at full productive capacity, to keep us at full employment.
Is there a practical limit to the size of the deficit?
Yeah, it's like the practical limit, you could say, would be inflation. I guess you could say. It's like I was just saying, trying to explain a minute ago, and with the analogy with the sink and the water. If you bring the economy to its full productive capacity, if the government just keeps spending beyond its full capacity, then you run an inflation risk. You can't produce anymore, so you've got too many dollars. You know, too many dollars chasing too many goods, as they say. You know, there's too much now. So you could say that inflation could be, or demand pull inflation specifically, could be the constraint on the deficit.
Back in around 1980, the inflation rates, or at least the interest rates, were around 17%. I assume the inflation rates were similar to that. Yet the deficit was much lower than it is today. Can you explain simply why that happened?
To be honest with you, I'm not particularly sure. I don't know. I do know they had a lot of, well, there was a lot of high deficit spending. That was during the Reagan era, if I remember. No,
it was Jimmy Carter.
It was Jimmy Carter? Okay, because I remember.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. 80 was Reagan, but so I got it wrong. The incident I talked about was during Carter.
during Carter. So what, the late 70s?
Yeah.
Was it? Now, what were you saying? The deficit was low or high?
Well, I'm saying that I remember getting a bank statement showing 17% um, uh, interest rates, which was
Hmm.
fabulous. So I assume inflation was close to that. And I'm assuming the deficit was less than it is now, just because they always talk about the deficit growing.
Yeah.
So we may have to do some fact checking on this, but
Yeah. I'm not sure what the what the deficits were at the time or anything else. I don't know, to be honest with you. Um, I do know that the the interest rates have to do, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But the interest rates are controlled by uh, the central bank, by the Federal Reserve, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. And it has to do with federal borrowing, basically, what we call federal borrowing. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know the specifics behind that, so I can't really answer that. But I think that's a cool question, you know, and that'd be something worth looking into. Um, so yeah, that kind of, I guess that could bring me to, I guess, talking about interest rates. Um, a common, let's back up here. A common misconception is, when people go down to the bank and take out a loan, they, and I've seen people say this myself, and I've even talked to some local bankers around here, and they'll say they get this all the time. But people think that if you want to come in and borrow money from the bank, get a loan, that somehow, the bank, has to have, sufficient people, sufficient savings from their other customers, to loan out, to the person who wants to borrow money. Um, and the fact of the matter is that's not the case at all. Um, from what I understand, from my readings in MMT or whatever, is that the banks will loan based on your credit worthiness. If you're deemed credit worthy, they will make a loan. And what they are effectively doing is they are loaning money into existence simply by marking up balance sheets. Or to be more specific, they're loaning you bank credit denominated in US dollars. In yep, yep, I believe that's the case right there. Yep, she just wrote. Um, but this doesn't add any net dollars to the economy, because when they make a loan, when the banks make a loan in the private sector, uh, there's two sides of a balance sheet. You have the financial asset on one side, and then you have a financial liability on the other side that's exactly equal to the financial asset. So this nets to zero in terms of uh, net financial assets in the economy that are added. It's only the federal government, the federal deficit spending, which adds net dollars to the economy. They're putting more dollars in than they're taking out. Now there are more net dollars in the economy. How they might get distributed, that's a whole other issue. But so that's a basic gist of how private lending works at private banks. Now, at the end of the day, they have, and you just mentioned reserve requirements. You just type that banks have what's called reserve requirements. And at the end of the day, private banks go on what's called the Fed funds market. And if they have a surplus of reserves, those who have surplus of reserves can lend reserves to those banks that have less than what that reserve requirement is. And the more, and what they call that's that interbank lending, they call the interest rate for that, they call the overnight rate. And the more reserves that are in the system, the lower that overnight rate. The less reserves that are in that system, the higher that overnight rate. And if a bank can't get the loan that they need to meet those reserve requirements, they can get a loan from the Federal Reserve, the central bank, which is often referred to as the lender of last resort. But they try to avoid that because the Fed will make a loan that's a higher overnight rate than what the other other banks will loan out. This is where federal borrowing comes in. Federal borrowing is the issuance of treasury securities. Lots of times people say, you'll hear this is one of these other beliefs that aren't correct, at least from an MMT perspective. It's like, oh, the federal government has to borrow these monies to fund that spending, and then we got to pay it back. Now, just as I was saying earlier about the federal taxes aren't actually funding the federal spending, because the federal spending had to come first before there were any dollars to take back in taxes. The same thing can be said for federal borrowing. The federal dollars had to be spent into existence first before there were any dollars to borrow, and it must serve some other function. And the function of which, borrowing, that is the issuance of treasury securities, is to drain reserves out of the private banking system so that the central bank can hit its targeted overnight rate. They have a targeted overnight rate. So if they issue a treasury security and say you buy a treasury security, what you are doing is you are taking dollars from your private banking account, and it gets transferred to a securities account at the central bank. It's taken out of the private banking system temporarily, and they'll of course put it back when the bond matures. They put it back with interest. So that's really the function of federal borrowing, federal treasury security issuance. It's not to fund the federal expenditures. The point fundamentally is to drain reserves out of the banking system so that the central bank can hit its targeted overnight rate. They control those rates, and then the commercial interest rates are related to that. The lower the overnight rate, the lower the commercial interest rates, and vice versa. If they want that overnight rate to go higher, they'll drain more reserves out of that system. If they want the overnight rate to go down, then they'll refrain from draining too many reserves out of the system. One of the things that MMT economists will often say is there's really no operational need for borrowing since we've gotten off the gold standard. There's no operational need for issuing treasury securities. It used to also function to maintain our the fixed exchange rate to gold, controlling the amount of dollars in the banking system. Plus, they had to control the interest rate. So it kind of served a function then, but it hasn't really served a function since we've been off the gold standard for almost 50 years now. And a lot of them will just advocate for we should just stop federal borrowing, just cease the issuance of treasury securities, and then the banking system will be flooded with reserves, and the overnight rate would just drop to zero, and then commercial rates would rise, above be above that. Like the prime rate, I think is 3%, would be like 3% or something like that, I think. And then just maintain that, and then focus more on fiscal policy. And to be clear, fiscal policy has to do with spending and taxation. Monetary policy has to do with the targeting of interest rates. So that's the MMT perspective on borrowing. To use maybe another example of something that you've probably all heard about numerous times is and the politicians like to fearmonger over, is the whole debt to China thing. Debt to China. Oh, we got $1 trillion debt to China, as Trump would say. And right off the bat, they make it sound like, oh, the federal government has to borrow dollars from China in order to spend. Federal government, which has a monopoly on creating the U.S. dollar, has to somehow borrow dollars from another country before it can spend. And oh my gosh, we have all this debt to China, and boy, like $1 trillion or whatever it is, we're all going to die. One of the leading MMT economists, Warren Moser is his name, I think really put it well. He says, well, this is how it kind of goes in the operational in terms of the operational reality. First of all, China has to get those dollars. They're just currency users as far as the U.S. dollar is concerned. They just use the dollar. They don't issue it. And this is done, say, through a trade deficit. So basically, you could say that they get, $1 trillion more of our currency, and we get $1 trillion more of their stuff, in relation. So we got their stuff. We got more of their stuff. They got our dollars. Now, what are these dollars? Where do they go? They're numbers. They start as numbers in what's called a reserve account at the central bank, at the Federal Reserve. They have a reserve account. And a reserve account, that's just a fancy term for all practical intents and purposes, a checking account. It's China's checking account. Now they have an option. Now they got to make a decision. What are they going to do? Well, they can go on a great big shopping spree in this great big super mall called the U.S. economy. Or they can shift those dollars from that reserve account over to what's called a securities account. Just like a reserve account is a fancy term for a checking account, a securities account is just a fancy term for a savings account. And that's what they opt to do. Shift it from the reserve account over to a securities account. They're buying treasury securities. So when it comes due, that's our debt to China right there. And a debt literally means an obligation. It means to owe. So when the time comes, those bonds mature, some bureaucrat at the central bank pulls out the keyboard, has to take those numbers out of the security account and shift it back over to the reserve account. Like shifting money from a savings account to a checking account, and then type in a little interest. Then apparently we're all going to die. Or if you listen to these politicians, that's how they make it sound. But that's just this is just basic everyday operational reality. You're just shifting numbers from reserve accounts, security accounts back to reserve accounts. And that's all it is. But people like the politicians love to say that, the $1 trillion debt to China. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? We're going to die. Think about the children, your grandchildren, blah, blah, and make it sound so scary, And a lot of this probably goes back to why that household analogy that even Gregg and Elaine was talking about earlier, how it just doesn't work, because we think of the big numbers like that in debt, and it's like, oh my gosh, how are we going to pay that back? The federal government issues the currency, not China. And all this is just transferring numbers from one account to another and back at the central bank. But it sounds way scarier, and it's better for headlines, I guess, to make it sound like we're all going to die or something. I don't know. But that's basically the whole debt to China thing from an MMT perspective. So I think what I'll probably, after I've talked about the MMT perspective on issuing the currency and the function of taxation, spending and taxation being fiscal policy, and it's about creating demand for the dollar, which is intrinsically worthless, and it's about controlling managing the economy. There you go, spending and taxation, and that borrowing is monetary policy. The issuance of treasury security is about the central government, the central bank, hitting their targeted overnight rates. It's about controlling interest rates. So far, this is what I've tried to accomplish here is basically what MMT is at its core. It's a description of the system that we already have. It just, that description may be contrary to what we normally think things are. It turns a lot on its head from what we normally think. Now, what MMT economists propose, and you could call this maybe the fundamental prescriptive policy, is something called the job guarantee, the federal job guarantee. And it's basically about how do we get the right amount of dollars into the economy at the right time, at the right place, during those cycles of fluctuation in the economy and so forth. how do we keep that sink from overflowing, right? But we keep it right there, that sweet spot right at the top, just enough, right amount of spending, right, just enough taxes. And what they propose is what's called the job guarantee. And it could be thought of here as what's called an automatic stabilizer. Now, an automatic stabilizer is any kind of government policy that helps to is that automatically manages the economy by getting dollars in, more dollars into the economy when we go into a downturn, less dollars when we're on the upswing. I sent an email, I think it was last night, using food stamps as an example, or EBT it's called now, electronic benefit transfer, traditionally known as food stamps. We think of food stamps as, feeding hungry people that are poor, and it certainly does that, of course. But the macroeconomic function of food stamps is to be what's called an automatic stabilizer. So, for example, say the economy goes into a downturn and people get laid off or they get their hours cut. Now they might qualify, even if they didn't before, they now might qualify to receive food stamps. So they get the food stamps, and then they go to the store and they buy food with it. So that's some spending that becomes the income for the stores. In other words, what it does is it helps put a floor on spending in the economy. So if the economy goes into a downturn, more people might qualify for food stamps. Then they take those food stamps, get to the store, buy food. That becomes income for the store. Now they're maintaining an income. They're going to turn around and spend that. Maybe they can spend it on hiring people or giving people more hours. They still got to spend it on other people, distributors to stock the shelves and so forth and so on. That's its macroeconomic function, is to put a floor on spending. So, and then it's injecting federal dollars into the economy via the food stamp program. And so if it's functioning properly, when the economy starts to go on a downturn, people get those food stamps, they spend them, and then hopefully that helps, at the very least, keep the economy from going down further, and maybe even help get the economy going back up again. The idea of a job guarantee, proposed by MMT economists, could be conceptualized to say the ultimate automatic stabilizer. The idea is to have a policy of full employment in this country, or any country that issues its own currency. It could be federally funded. It would be federally funded, but locally managed. So say, for example, we already have people that are unemployed. Meaning they're looking for work in the private sector and they can't find it. You have people that are underemployed. The idea of a federal job guarantee, which probably could be done through, say, the local, unemployment office, could become the employment office now, and then find some work, something to do in the local community. And this would be federally funded. This would be dollars injected, basically more federal dollars injected into the economy. And what are the people going to do with that paycheck, these dollars, around, spend them back in a lot of it back there in the local economy. That becomes more income for businesses, who in turn spend that, and then they can hire people. Right now, one of the things about in mainstream economics is that the idea is that if we had full employment, we somehow risk having inflation somehow. And so using unemployed and a certain level of unemployment in the community, in the society, to control inflation, which seems terribly cruel, but and unemployed people are basically used as what's called a buffer stock, against inflation. When MMT economists are come along and saying, no, let's have people work in the local public sector, it's federally funded, and you're using employed people now as a buffer stock. And because there'd be some kind of corresponding real output, you're minimizing the inflationary risk. And so if the economy starts to go into a downturn and then people start getting laid off, and it's always going to be people at the bottom, so-called unskilled labor, your cashiers at Walmart, your burger flippers at McDonald's or whatever, they're the ones who are going to end up losing their job first or getting their hours cut. They're certainly not going to be hiring anybody new. But if they're not making money, they don't have money to spend. If they don't have money to spend, businesses aren't getting income, and that's just going to make the problem even worse. The problem is going to spiral downwards. The idea of the job guarantee is that that's fine. If you can't find work, or if we start to go on economic downturn, you get laid off, or if you're underemployed, and maybe you want to have some supplemental income, the idea of a federal job guarantee is you go down to the federal job guarantee office and you find something in your local community to do. Okay, and it'll be federally funded, be injecting dollars into the economy. And we can all look around our communities, and there's plenty to do. There can always be something to do. They might say to the person looking for work, who's unemployed or underemployed, well, what do you like to do? I like to work in my garden. Well, have them go plant flowers along the hiking trail if they have one or something, or you help out in the community garden or start one maybe if they don't have one. Or somebody could say, oh, I love animals. Hey, I really like animals. Well, go help them out at the animal shelter. Or I like to read. Why don't you go help them out at the library? I really like kids. I like kids a lot. Well, boy, they could always use an extra pair of hands at the local public school system doing, helping the teachers out doing something, They could always use a teacher's assistant or something. We have an aging population, a lot of elderly people, a lot of boomers who've retired or retiring. Maybe somebody, maybe people like just, I've known plenty of people, they just love to help people. They just love helping people out. Maybe you could have a job in your community helping elderly folks. Maybe you go over and do some of their housework for them. They have a hard time getting around or driving to their appointments or whatever. The point is, with the whole federal job guarantee concept, is that one, it serves as its economic function could serve as an automatic stabilizer. The economy starts to go down, more dollars get injected in the economy because people will get shifted from the private sector to the job guarantee program. They get paid federally, therefore more dollars are getting into the economy when it's needed most, where it's needed most. They'll turn around and spend that back in the private sector. Private sector starts to do better. Then the private sector can, instead of hiring people that are unemployed, they're hiring people that are employed. They're just employed in the local public sector under the job guarantee program. They can hire them. And what's usually proposed is, say, for the program would be like $15 an hour, and if that's the case, then really that effectively becomes the minimum wage for all practical intents and purposes. I mean, you could have, I think the $7.50 or something ridiculous is the federal minimum wage right now. I mean, you could still, heck, could have that on the books, but why would you go work in the private sector for $7.50 if you're working in the job guarantee program for twice as much? You could even say that it's superior to a minimum wage in the sense that, the minimum wage laws aren't adding any dollars to the economy. They're just shifting more dollars from one account to another. If you raise the minimum wage $1 an hour, then you work 40 hours a week. So, 40 extra dollars are being shifted from the employer's bank account to the employee's bank account, but it all nets the same in the economy. At least with the job guarantee idea, actual more net dollars are being added to the economy. And then they're going to turn around and spend it in the private sector. That becomes the income in the private sector. So they actually have more dollars and they'd be more busy and they'd have more dollars to hire people as well off the job guarantee. And you could say that whatever that job guarantee program is, whatever that pay is, or even if there's even any benefits, however that's really set up, sets up the bare minimum for how workers should be treated in this country. Whatever that is, this is the bare minimum standard.
Jason, I'm gonna need to go really quick. I just had a couple thoughts that I wanted to add, if that's okay. I think that's some of that job guarantee stuff is really important that we start thinking about that. But the part that wasn't mentioned in your email and is not really getting addressed here is what I think a lot of people will come back to with is then there's no motivation to do anything. So there may be a lot of people just kind of receiving money because if it's guaranteed, then there's no threat of not getting the money and not doing anything. And like, what do we do with that, right? I'm not sure that's horrible because people having money does create spending places and that may not be the worst thing in the world, but I don't know that people will necessarily be motivated to like work really hard if it's guaranteed. Like the fact of guaranteeing takes away.
The job is guaranteed, yeah.
Yeah, like work being a thing that I'm choosing to do for exchange of money. If that's then guaranteed, I don't maybe have to do the work, or I don't have to work hard, or I can fake it and all that stuff. So there's, people are going to have that concern about that. The other point about the money to China thing that seemed really interesting. I totally agree. The fiction of money, right? I think you said it was, worthlessness in the dollars, or that it's just digits that we're doing.
It's intrinsically worthless. Yep.
Intrinsically worthless. But so is everything until we value it, right? Sure. So it's that connection of the representation to the value that matters. So power is deeply tied to this, right? So if you're the most powerful, if you're the issuer, you can kind of tell people how it's going to go. You can make more money. You can change the value of things. Businesses do this too. I can decide to charge 3 times for my coaching. And if I can get people to agree, like value is not a real thing. It's relative in the agreement of what we decide things are valued at and the representation of that in money. So it's a little bit stickier if you say, we'll just not print or through digits, create the trillion to pay back China. If China says no, because they're believing in a certain system and that's not okay with them. And then we owe them lots of money because they've invested in us or exchanged goods for our treasury bills or whatever's going on there. So it's a little stickier than it's just numbers on a spreadsheet and nobody cares because we're believing in something. So one of the things that I think is really important is we need to alter our beliefs about this exchange. Things like a job guarantee are a good start to talk about that through employment problems and all that. But also like interest is a little more complex in that, it's use of money over time. I think people sort of thinking that there's a money pie and that it's one real thing and it can't kind of expand and contract based on our own belief systems or whatever the power players are creating. But interest isn't really in the math, right? Like there's certain dollars and then I'm going to loan it to you and then that interest kind of doesn't exist anywhere. And this is what creates that, like, I've got to pay it back and use of money over time. So some of these things seem a little more complex than this, the way this is being represented. But a lot of this seems really valuable. I think it's a very valuable talk. I just think that link to how we value it and view it is the important piece. We can't just make it numbers on a screen at all because we have to agree on what things are or there's no exchange and things start to break down and countries go to war and all that stuff. So, you know what I mean? Those important details,
Well, I think what I was just trying to say about the whole debt to China thing is my understanding of it is that they had to acquire those dollars first, China, and like through a trade deficit, and then it's sitting in a reserve account, and instead of spending that, which they could do, they shifted over to what's called a securities account, and at some future date, the government has an obligation.
Yeah.
Shift that back to the reserve account, and then put in a little interest. What's that? That's basically what's operationally done in the most basic sense from what I understand.
That's what's already happening.
It's not like oh no, quick, oh my gosh, we got to scrape together $1 trillion through taxes and give it back to China, or they're going to repo the U.S. or something.
One of the theories about this, though, is if we just keep printing, then nobody believes in our money in the same way, and we lose being the sort of currency of the world and all those problems, right? So because we believe in the economic system in the way that we do, that has ideas and restrictions about just infinitely printing, right? Because then we're just saying, we just get to do whatever we want, and other countries may not keep believing in that as well.
Well, it's not about printing money, and it's not about doing it infinitely. I mean, what I'm saying, what I've been trying to say is simply MMT economists, and certainly they could do it much better than I could, but describing the operational reality of what already happens is, these days it's just about, it's all keystrokes. It's not printing or anything like that. But it's not a matter of should they do such and such when they spend or tax. What they're saying is that the actual operational reality is when they spend, they're literally creating dollars.
Sure.
By creating accounts. They're already doing that. When they tax, they are literally destroying dollars by debiting accounts. Hence the analogy of the putting points on a scoreboard at a football game. Nobody goes, well, gee, where's the scorekeeper going to find the points to put on the board? Boy, I hope it's not a high-scoring game. We don't want to devalue the points. I mean, they get a touchdown, they put up 6 points. Oh, the touchdown didn't count. We take the 6 points off. Where did it come from? Where did it go? Over thin air. But that's how they're saying it. This already works. When they spend, they're literally, it's the numbers that's the money, not the paper.
So I'm not disagreeing with that. Go ahead. Sorry, Greg.
Okay. Yeah.
So I mean, I lack nuance in economics and finance in the way that I do in some other fields. So I'll come at this from a slightly psychological view and then see if you can. So it seemed to me as I heard this, all right, and if I think of myself as the government, okay, this opens up the government relationship with money in a radically different way than at least it's portrayed to the people. Okay, so in other words, it would be like, all of a sudden the government's currency is now able to be directed and flowed in a way that's so much more open and freeing than at least the narrative that's given, right? In terms of the deficit, in terms of what we could do with healthcare, in terms of all this other elements. So it's interesting to me, and then I'm guessing my question is, well, how do you understand why there's then resistance to this, or what is the critique that brings the resistance? Because what I would say is that if this were real, okay, and what the MMT theory people say is just really all there is, and we can do the scoreboard thing, and we can do the sync, and we can do all this other stuff, and we could do jobs guarantee. The flexibility of the government in relationship to the way it can flow money into the system opens up tremendously, and the restrictions that seemingly operate in relation to it dissipate. And that's why a lot of people certainly I think a gut reaction is, oh my God, it's like too good to be true, or this creates sort of money in a particular kind of way. So it's interesting to me then that, so is it the delusional beliefs that people have in their old way of thinking about money that prevents them from operating from this? Or what are the other elements that then prevent this way of thinking and way of conceiving money from the government from being more popular and utilized?
Yeah. That'd be a great question maybe for a psychologist to research who might find MMT interesting. You see it a lot, I mean, you could explain it, and it's all you could see people saying, oh, that's really interesting, it's fascinating, I want to learn more. And other people just want to resist it. They don't want to believe that. Or
can I say something? Yeah, like at the heart of this are belief systems, for sure. And some of the ideas of like trickle down economics, right? So if we make the businesses really wealthy, somehow that's going to make opportunity come down. Now, a lot more popularly, people are saying, let's inject it down here to spend, and that will trickle up. The Federal Reserve is actually not federal. Like that's a bank that is in relationship with the government in a very interesting way. And so we have very big power players at the top of both government and business/corporations that are dialing a lot of these things that the little guys don't have a lot to say about. And so there are many ideas about how those actors may be motivated to not necessarily make things work for everyone as equally as for themselves. So people in power at whatever level of power, whether that's behind the money, whether that's behind, military force, all those things. I mean, at the very beginning of money, when you had tribes, there was exchange and there was trust in those exchanges. It was when you had to go to another tribe where force had to be brought to make sure that the exchange was honored in whatever way was done. So like force and money have always been together. And so then when you get representation of money in a system like the Roman Empire or whatever, it starts to be government currency to try to protect against counterfeiting and just the small agents making their own money, because there needs to be a control of that system. That control is deeply out of balance, and there's all kinds of narrative about how to do that and belief structures. And those really need to be rethought, because we're at a place where our shared justification system about that is wiggling and about to collapse in many ways. But we'll see that in emergency, the government will infuse money into the people so that we don't revolt or whatever's going on. And we can do that pretty much whenever we want. But if we just said we're going to do that all the time, that makes a very different narrative for work and everything else that we're doing that's so important. So I don't know if all that made sense or not, but.
It's funny what you just said about how, when things are dire or something, about how,
real quickly, they'll infuse a bunch of cash, right? Yeah.
It's funny because Stephanie Kelton, who I mentioned before, is one of the leading MMT economists. She wrote an article a couple months back. I'll have to see if I can find it, because she was actually, I was mentioning, she was working in the Senate. She was appointed back in December of 2015 as the chief economist for the Democrats back in 2015 in the U.S. Senate. And so she's familiar with kind of the political games and stuff they play or whatever. But she wrote an article. She said when they did this whole thing with the sending everybody $1,200 during this whole pandemic thing that's going on right now. What they usually do, how should you put that? What they'll do is they'll say they'll authorize the spending, but then they'll authorize, the same amount in taxation or whatever. The whole pay-go thing. I think Nancy Pelosi calls it pay-as-you-go or whatever, which is basically just saying we have a policy where we're going to take, for every dollar we put in the economy, we're going to take one out, right? And she was talking about how when they passed this, they passed the authorizing of the spending of the $1,200, but they were in a huge hurry to do it because talk about a dire situation. They didn't pass the taxation thing along with it. It was just, okay, we're going to mark everybody's account by $1,200 or send them a $1,200 check or whatever. But there was no corresponding legislation about taxing that same amount out. So she was. I have to find the article, but she was like, this kind of demonstrates what people like me have been saying.
Yeah,
they don't need your tax dollars before they spend. They just spend it, and then they'll just go and mark up the accounts. If they have to do that, but it was an interesting. I was kind of humored by it actually, the article, but it was interesting.
Lee, you have a question?
Yeah. Do you know of any countries where their policies are largely, or at least even obviously, informed by MMT?
Probably not. I mean, it seems like the sort of neoliberal.
Where's Norway? Can't they get going with this?
Yeah, maybe they'd be more likely. Well, I don't know. Is Norway a Euro?
I don't know. But let's go with New Zealand.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a number of countries around the world. New Zealand would be one, where they think a little more progressively than we do. This idea just seems so simple and so compelling and has so many benefits. Somebody must have tried it.
Yeah. Let's just say that, well, who knows? Maybe soon. I mean, the whole MMT, the ideas from MMT economists I only probably first heard of it, 6 or 7 years ago, maybe. And only in the past, maybe 4 years, maybe, or so. Did I start seeing the ideas just kind of boom and get out there.
They're pretty young.
I just saw them in like Forbes magazine and Business Insider or Business Week. I mean, you know, I've seen Stephanie Kelton on TV on mainstream channel like CNN and MSNBC talking, but I was kind of surprised because when I first heard about it, you know, and I think I heard about it like, you know, heard it mentioned on like social media, you know, or something, and I was like, okay, I'll check this out. And I just Googled it, and I saw somebody wrote some blog on it. It's just a short blog, and it's like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, why didn't I figure this out myself? It just made the way they wrote it in a very simple way about taxes driving the currency and cyclical balances and that sort of thing. It just made perfect sense to me. But there wasn't many of us, even on say social media, that knew this. I mean, there was probably just a handful of us that I knew
So here's
of.
an idea.
So over time, you know, to see it become so, at least people have heard of it, and to see it in mainstream media so quickly, kind of is a little shocking to me. Who knows what the next 5 or 10 years could bring? I don't know.
So here's an idea. We should ask New Zealand to give it a try, and if it doesn't work out, we'll just bail them out.
Mike, did you have a question?
May have already answered it, Jason. So it seems to me that you've talked about how MMT differs from kind of a lay, commonsensical view of money and economy. How does MMT differ from fundamentally from mainstream economics, mainstream macroeconomics? What's the basic difference?
Well, I mean, I think you know, mainstream economics will basically take almost the opposite perspective, that they treat, you know, they treat the dollar as, they treat the federal government as a currency user. Like I was making that distinction, the currency issuer and the currency user, and a lot of them start with a sort of an individual, the Homo economicus perspective, the perfectly rational individual, you know, where as opposed to say, you know, MMT, which is more of a macroeconomic perspective, it starts at the level of, you know, the government and those institutions and how they relate to each other, and how they issue the currency. They'll say that they'll come at it from what's called what used to be called a long time ago a chartalist perspective, chartalism, the issue of state issued currency. That's how MMTers will take it. Sometimes MMT is even called neo-chartalism. The sort of mainstream economics will come at it from the perspective of people used to barter back in ancient times, and then they came up with some medium of exchange, you know, like gold or seashells or something, and then they came up with money that represent that. And, you know, they come at it and they just come at the entire thing from probably opposite angles, you know.
Jason, can I just ask? The last few minutes hasn't really made sense to me, because in one sense, I'm feeling as though MMT is a descriptor of exactly what's going on now. So when Lee is asking who's going to take this on, it's like this is already what's going on. This is just a different way to describe what's going on in one sense. And then the new things would be things like applying job guarantees, because we now kind of know the truth behind the scenes to a little bit more degree. You know, this isn't saying it's exactly accurate, but like, this isn't, I'm not getting how this is both a description of what is, but also like a whole new idea. It's, which is it, right? Like, and I think, isn't it just a different way to think about issuer, really understanding that the government is the issuer of the money. Of course, they can make more as they issue, right? That's their choice, and they have the power to do that. And then how the economics works, like that we're just being, you know, consciously or unconsciously misinformed as to what the real drivers are. And we could all calm down a little if we make different decisions, right, about what the story is, about how what money is and what exchange is. Because value is infinite. Like Target creates money when they hand out coupons and whatnot, right? Like those are things that can be exchanged for real goods. If there were really no money, I might start exchanging mowing lawns for a massage or whatever. Like what side economies happen all the time, but the real structure of making the big things happen and having people trust over time that something will happen. I mean, the birth of corporations, as flawed as they are being treated as humans, is so that you can invest in something to do something that's longer than potentially a human life, right? If you invested in a guy and he was the only guy to do it, he was the individual and he died in the process, your investment is gone. So we create corporations to protect agreements between people so that larger, more complex, multi-people thing can occur, right? And so this seems to me to be a description of what's going on, albeit probably simplified a little bit, but a good understanding of what is now. So to Lee's point, I feel like everyone's doing this now to whatever degree. And then there's applications of this that we're not doing yet, but we could if we thought about it this way. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, basically. I mean, what MMT, like I said, is its core is it's a description of how sovereign currencies work and that sort of thing. That description just tends to fundamentally contradict what maybe we might normally think. We think of things like, oh my gosh, federal deficit's bad. And they'll come at it from the perspective of sectoral balances and say.
And everybody, this move to digital and keystrokes is interesting because someone like my father would argue, well, we got off the gold standard and that was it. But the belief in the value in gold being the thing was as much a fiction as a keystroke or a digital thing or anything else, right? So solving this problem of exchange and how we value, right? Because again, value is infinite. Value is something like we can keep innovating, we can create new things, we can find interest in things we want to pay for. That's not there's no cap on that. There's no set pie. So how we represent that exchange and that infinite kind of growth of what value could be really becomes interesting. I think that store of value, like families that store value over time that sort of pulls money out of some economy, becomes a bit of a problem. There's a power that happens there. It's almost like, should money expire like an apple would expire? It's like the use of it is almost the interesting thing for the collective, but the individual's power is really interested to try and hold and grow and do all that stuff. So all of those things, I think we're going to all see very soon are going to be rethought. We're going to have to rethink them in really interesting ways. And I think this is a pretty good and neat descriptor to get that whole thing started as we fall into more complexity in the world. So,
Mike's got a question. And then,
poor Steve.
I think Mike raised his hand. Yeah, Steve. I think Mike raised his hand first.
No, go ahead.
Steve, please.
Oh, just a quick question.
Sure.
I'm toying with the question of value, and I'm asking myself what kinds of questions are MMT theorists thinking as primary in the domain of value, and what is, if I'm not an economist, so hopefully I'll get the language right here, but clearly to declare that the federal government having a deficit is not a primary value concern. Would it be fair to say, I'm just trying to kind of look for the core value, and a country, an economy that is not effectively utilizing its resources is the core problem. That is, you do not have full employment. That would be one example of that. That's part of that problem. So what you want is an economy that is effectively mobilizing the resources available in that particular, whatever, region, country, state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that one of the things I'll hear MMT economists often say is the goal should be getting an economy at full productivity with price stability. It's like you were just saying, utilizing it's about the real resources and utilizing our real resources effectively. Yeah. I think that kind of probably nails it pretty good. A core value, I suppose you could say. Yeah.
Mike?
Yeah, I want to say something, and then I'm going to ask somebody else to tell me what I mean, because I don't know what I mean. So the question that keeps coming to my mind is, where does money get its value from? Where does money get its value from? And it seems to me that that we can't get away from the idea, correct me if I'm wrong, that money has its value, gains at least part of its value through the relation between the people who are using it, the users, the relation between the users within a denomination, within a context. So that if we're starting a society and you're making you have sheep and I have iron, and we try to exchange that. Money gives us a means of that exchange, a means of equalizing the worth of how many sheeps to an iron, if you will, so that the material and social conditions of the time in that relation is not irrelevant. It's very relevant to determining what the value of the money is. So it's not simply we can make the value whatever we want. It's not simply a matter of the infusion of money into the economy. There's also this other, what I think I want to call a self-organizing system, that the value of money is a self-organizing system, if you will, that gets tweaked from above by a government, by government policy to try to stabilize that self-organizing system. That's what I want to say. What do I mean? I think what I'm doing is what's in my head is a feeling of that there seems to be something arbitrary, and I could be wrong about that, about MMT, that they're suggesting that there's an arbitrariness to it all. And yes, of course there is, but it's a constrained arbitrariness, right? That money gets its value from somewhere. And I worry that, and I can't put this into words, I worry that, let's say deficit spending or making too much money leads to inflation, and that if you don't consider what I'm calling the self-organizing system of how money gets its value, that the whole damn thing can collapse. I don't know what I'm saying, and that's the limits of my ability to know.
Can I try something?
Please.
I think in Mike's question, he's confusing the government creates currency and it doesn't care how it's valued. The people spend currency and they tell each other stories about how much it's worth.
Interesting. It's interesting.
But it's also the case that if we think about the sink, remember, there's the shape of the sink, basically, okay? Yeah. Which is essentially the relational exchange of investment and the utility of that process, right? So when you have a well-functioning economy, you have the sheep and the iron and the services all flowing in a particular way where the mutuality of the benefit increases, right? There are many systems where if you jam the resources in a particular way, you can throw money at it, but you're not creating the actual resource wealth of the sink, okay? So one of the major considerations that is the interrelations say a lot about the mutuality of the effectiveness of the flow. Are you creating increasing amounts of potential energy so that the size of the sink basically is increasing, or are you creating a very, very shallow sink, which basically means that you don't have the access, and therefore you'll flow it over. In some places like Chile that blow up their economy or whatever, that they don't have the right kind of flow, then they can dump money into it, and then it's a shallow sink, all the money falls over, and you're in deep trouble in that regard. So it's about making the sink the right deep breadth size. At least that's, if I'm going to go with the metaphor, that's at least where I would go.
That helps me a little bit. Leland, to say that money is fundamentally a story, it seems to me relies upon what we mean by the term story. If you mean by story, a fiction, a creation, I think it's more than that. If by story you mean a representation of the flux of events as they interact with each other, that the story, the story is constrained by that which the story is about. It doesn't have its own autonomy. I think that money is fundamentally a story is maybe a little too glib. And I can't believe you're saying this, Mr. Reality, the guy who says there's this reality out there that how do you?
All of life is either a reality, it's either brute facts or a story, Mike. Okay, and money is a social construct, so it's not a brute fact. The story of money is you can always redeem it. Okay, as long as the story is you can always redeem it, it's fine. Let's take a look at Confederate dollars, okay? During the Civil War, the story was, we're the South, we're the Confederate, we're the good guys, we can spend it. At Appomattox or whatever, that story was tested. And the same physical thingy, the story is, you guys lost and this is worthless. So the outcome of the war changed the story around Confederate dollars, and they became worthwhile when they were issued and worthless at the end, okay? Another story is around, I'd say, modern art, okay? The story is that this painting is worth $15 million, and if enough people believe that story, they'll outbid themselves, and there it will be. If that story collapses for whatever reason, and I don't know who's going to explain to me how you have to rearrange the paint to make that story go or not, the value collapses, and you're out of here.
Yeah, the stories, I like what you said. The stories are kind of mediums. They're things that mediate our social interaction in the real experienced world. So the stories are always embedded. They don't function by themselves. They don't function by themselves. They're constrained.
Now, there is one brute fact that grounds the story of money, which is that you can pay taxes with it. As long as you can pay taxes with it, then you can keep the real IRS agent off of your back from taking your house, your real house, and so on. So that grounds the story in brute facts. So that's got to be there. And then the rest of it is, you like my painting? Pay me.
Right. You could think of dollars as federal tax credits. Fundamentally, that's what they are. You've got federal tax credits. They issue it, you know, going back to day one, they issue the dollar and they say, okay, now we're gonna levy a tax, but we're only gonna accept our own currency back in the tax to meet your tax obligations. Well, now everybody wants to get their hands on this because they value not getting in trouble with the government, with the state, which by definition has a monopoly of force over a given geographical area. They don't want to lose their real resources like their house or something, or go to jail or whatever. They value not getting in trouble. And now if once, you know, so, and another thing too that's often brought up is now the government has a means by which to provision itself with real resources. So, you know, they might say, you know, hey, you know, we need pencils or whatever. Now they can exchange pencils. Somebody who makes pencils, they get pencils and give them dollars, and then they can use those dollars to meet their tax obligations later on. Hey, maybe they've got some dollars left over. Now somebody over here is saying, hey, I gotta meet my tax obligations. I'll sell you some a bushel of apples or whatever. I'll sell you some apples for those dollars, and then they can get dollars and then use that to satisfy their tax obligations.
I want to thank you.
Yes.
What you have done is you've taken my knowledge of economics and you've moved it from -15 to -7, and I really appreciate that.
That's, I think we're in the same boat there. So
I think I got this right here. This book I mentioned Stephanie Kelton, one of the leading MMT economists. She just came out with called The Deficit Myth. Just came out with that book. You know, a book that just came out this past May or June, I think. I haven't had a chance to read it all through yet, but Stephanie Kelton is terrific. She writes in a very clear way, and you know, it's a book from, you know, for just, you know, regular folks like us, maybe who don't know a whole lot about economics, and really explains MMT in a very easy to understand way. So,
well, I think I
would recommend that to anybody if they're interested in maybe learning a little more. And that might get you up from a -7 up to a 0. You know?
all right.
Which is more improvement, you know.
Hey man, that's right. Well, we're getting the balance sheet right. No.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so I like that deficit myth title because actually, certainly for me, if there's any take-home message, I think Lee put that it's how we think about deficits. Certainly,
Mhm.
this definitely transforms me in relationship to this. And it does also open up, I think, lots of possible creative ways of redirect. I think the real implications, if this description is accurate and the implications that MMP people argue hold across all the potential ramifications with those two big ifs, if those things are true, the potential to direct government power, economic power toward the good is actually very, very high, I think. And so I hope that these ideas continue to be reflected on and explored by people who understand economics way better than I do. So I really appreciate, Jason, you coming and sharing your knowledge, and definitely, your contributions to the list. And my knowledge of economics has moved maybe to -8. So that's good. So thank you so much. Really
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
appreciate it.
And it was a great discussion, by the way, too.
Yeah. So next week we have my dad coming to talk about George Washington, the founding father. My father will be coming and talking about a founding father.
Your founding father.
My founding father will be talking about the country's founding father. So Lee, did you have a?
If anyone has a minute or two, can we try out the lounge?
Yes, I'll go ahead and put the lounge up here in the list.
You have the URL? Okay, I was going to use mine, but if you got one, go ahead.
Yeah, let me, I'll get the URL and then I'll send it. Okay. I've actually have to go, so I will not, I'll make sure that it's there. So there it is.
Keep in mind, you cannot use YoTribe at the same time as Zoom.
Right, so anyone who wants to go to the lounge, copy that real fast. And then we did record this. I'll send out a note. If anybody has any concerns, I won't put it up, but by Wednesday, we did record this. So 10 seconds, I'm gonna cut off. Make sure you have this. I'll pop over to YoTribe for 2 seconds just to see if anybody's there. But it's 7 o'clock and I've said that I will be someplace very shortly. But this YoTribe thing hopefully will be a cool lounge for the program.
Your wife,
Yeah. 3, 2, 1. Take care, guys.